All right. New episode Into the Metaverse. With me today is Jacob from Spatial. Jacob, great to have you.
Great to be here, Jan. How you doing, man?
I know it's been a while. Jewish high holidays are done. We're ready to get back to business. So, with that in mind, I know a lot of folks know Spatial. I know a lot of folks who don't know Spatial. I know a lot of folks who know of Spatial but don't necessarily know what is Spatial. So, this is an opportunity to unpack all of those things. But let's start first and foremost, Jacob, with your journey of joining and kind of co-piloting Spatial over the last 6 years. Give us the how, the why, and how the platform and the company has evolved over those years.
Absolutely. And I hope this is the medium version, not the long or the short version. So, like, if people fall asleep in the middle, I'm just going to snap to wake everyone up. So, about 7 years ago, I was working at Samsung Next, which is Samsung's early stage VC. At that time, they used to do M&A and certain things for Samsung. And my role was to be squarely focused on sort of the next wave of content and technology that was coming in the XR space. So, particularly focused on VR, AR, MR wasn't as much a thing then. And that had a lot of overlapping focuses. So there was a little bit of AI and computer vision. There was a lot of gaming, obviously, at that time. That was kind of the center of that world. And I was looking at a lot of mobile augmented reality companies. So, like, sort of like after Pokemon Go started blowing up, I think people were really interested in whether you would point your phone at the world and play games. And we met Spatial, and a lot of it was really because Jinha, who's the co-founder of Spatial, was a very successful, sort of very young executive at Samsung. He had previously given a TED Talk, MIT Media Lab PhD, and he and our CEO and other founder, Anand, had this vision at that time, which was basically, we think that something you wear on your face is potentially going to replace some combination of like the phone and the computer. And Anand's first company that he sold to Google was this company called BumpTop, and they basically figured out like the first touch interface. So as the iPhone was happening and mobile was becoming a thing, he basically had a thesis about how you should be using your hands to interact with information. And that really influenced a lot of mobile development because people needed to understand very simply how to use these devices for them to become a thing. And they felt, okay, that needs to be true in XR as well. Like, what is, almost like the Android for XR look like? That defines, how you interact with things and what good user experiences, etc. Broad vision, no product, and they were just two, very successful individuals that got the buy-in from some investors to go and figure the thing out. And we invested in them. Samsung invested in them pretty early, like seed round. And I worked with them very, very closely for a year as they were honing in on the product. And the first product came to be an augmented reality collaboration tool. Nothing to do with gaming, nothing to do with UGC, could not have been further from Roblox or UEFN at that stage. And the idea was basically like, I'm wearing a headset and I feel it's like Kingsman. I feel like I'm in the room with people that they're everywhere else in the world. And opened up some really great opportunities and doors. We were on the stage with like Satya Nadella at the launch of the Microsoft HoloLens 2. And it turned into a pretty exciting enterprise business because at that time, the headset was $3,500. Your average consumer was not spending that on a headset. And it turned into a nice enterprise business working with customers like Pfizer and Mattel and sort of these like true capital E Fortune 500 companies. And that was going well. And then COVID hit, and which it seems, I guess, like ancient history, or maybe it was yesterday. I don't know. I can't process time anymore. But like during COVID, the feedback we got was, hey, I can't get my hands on a headset. There's got to be some other way to use this. And we really need this now because we're so distributed everywhere in the world. Everyone's working remotely. We can't be on Zoom and Google Meet anymore. We need something that's more connected. And so listening to user feedback, we basically did a couple of things, but essentially we launched not only on these expensive headsets, but on the Oculus Quest 2, which was very, very inexpensive. At its cheapest point, it was like $200 on existing mobile devices, phone and tablet, iOS, Android, and then eventually on the web browser. And this is, I think, what really changed where the company went a lot. Because what ended up happening was like in 2020 into 2021, we started getting discovered by just creative types who were like, I don't have a headset. I'm not using this for collaboration, but actually I can build some really simple immersive experiences with this. And I could start building things like galleries, and I could build onboarding spaces. I could build community meetup spaces. And it started kind of transforming from this like very enterprisey tool into something that was crossing over a little bit into consumer. And then and we're not a crypto company, but when like in 2020, 21, when like there was a real crypto boom, like NFTs were a thing, that community sort of organically discovered the product, particularly the NFT world. They were like, okay, we've made these like decentralized digital assets. Allegedly, they're worth something. Like, what are we going to do with them? And people started literally just like taking art and putting it into spatial. And that was like one of our biggest growth peaks we ever saw. I mean, truly, like in the span of a couple of months, we like 10x'd because that whole Web3 world came in and realized that we had this, free to use tool that allowed them to build out some of the experiences that lent value. And that's when we hit the first big fork in the road, which was basically like, do we lean into this or do we lean into the enterprise business? It was like WAGMI or like government security and like SOC 2 and all this stuff. So this was between Series A and Series B. And when we were talking to like the investors for Series B, there was just a lot of enthusiasm about kind of going the big home run swing consumer route, and we went for it. And then very quickly, like a year into it, the kind of bottom just very quickly fell out of the crypto space. Now, fortunately for us, in that year, we had been pitched everything. People were like, you need to sell virtual land. Like, this is the future of the metaverse. You have to create your own decentralized token, like all this stuff. And we said no to all of it, largely because we just didn't understand it. Like, we couldn't wrap our heads around, like, well, why would this land hold value if there's nothing to do with it? Or this token feels very speculative. Like, if the bubble bursts, what happens? And so we kind of dodged a bullet there. But then what were we going to do? And this was now like 2022. And we had gotten a lot of feedback, even in the Web3 world, where people said, okay, it's cute to kind of have avatars standing around in a virtual space looking at art. But like, if people are going to come back, if they're going to really spend time in these experiences, you need to be able to do stuff in them. And we like went back and forth of like, well, what does that mean? And what would the tool set be to enable that? And we were like, well, we have two options. We could either like rebuild Unity in the web, because people are basically asking for a game engine to build interactivity and all this conditional logic, or we could just allow people to build in Unity and like become a layer on top of Unity. And for us, like, we're really big fans of Unity. Spatial itself is built on Unity. Like, we just felt that it's so good, it would be crazy for us to just like try and rebuild something this robust. And so we made an SDK on top of Unity, and it's pretty wild. It basically allows you to publish to Spatial with Unity the way that an Unreal developer might publish to UEFN from Unreal Engine. So we basically said, we're going to take like a meaty chunk, call it like 70% of Unity, that we've basically filtered down in order to ensure that our experiences work well across platform. And we're going to make it so you can publish. And that was the beginning of Spatial, really, is this UGC like platform. And that's where we've been. So like for the last 2 years, we really set out to be in that world of like Roblox and UEFN. The short of it being like, hey, can we make it easier for someone to develop a game? Can we democratize that so that instead of having to worry about everything, am I going to put this on Steam, and how am I going to monetize it, and how am I going to market it? Can we basically just say, you worry about the creative part, and then you click publish. And if you want to monetize it, there's a centralized currency you could use. If you want to host it and have it be multiplayer, it's just hosted. If you want avatars, you have avatars. Like, all of that is given to you. And the platform overwhelmingly that people have published on is web. And so I'd say like, if part A is like really, really easy to publish games, part B is like needs to be really, really easy for people to play them, because these smaller game developers don't have money to try and market in the app store. And so they just want people to like get in and click. And that's what you can do on Spatial. So if you didn't want a 10-minute answer, sorry, but
Quite the evolution. And do you feel like, if you go back to that fork on the road, enterprise versus consumer, given where we are now with the market, and we'll talk about other platforms and the challenge of building a new platform, where do you think a different path would have led Spatial, for example, on the enterprise side? And do you think there still a compelling vision around these type of kind of enterprise 3D environment, right? Almost like, is there an enterprise metaverse technology that ultimately will need to be available for enterprises or is that still too early?
The short answer is absolutely. And it's happening now, and there's a good amount of money in it. And I'm going to tell you two anecdotes about this very quickly. So first is had we focused on enterprise then, so had in 2021 if we had gone the other way, I think we would have done well, but I think we would have gone very niche. Because at that time, the phase that you were in sort of like the enterprise metaverse world was like you would go to an enterprise, they might be willing to give you a big contract, but with that would come very, very specific requirements, not just about their infrastructure, but about their use case. And you would essentially have to customize the tool to precisely what they want, which presents challenges because if you're trying to scale your product, you might end up with something that's like very useful for company A, but then not so much for company B. And
More of a
and
managed service rather than a scalable product.
Exactly. And so then what ends up happening is you precisely as you just said, you're going to make good money basically charging for services. Yeah, I'll charge you because we're going to build this and it's going to take this many people. And there are a lot of companies out there like that's like a seven-figure business, no doubt. But it's probably not an eight, maybe even into nine-figure business. It just can't scale because those contracts take forever to close. But then I think the question is, well, what about today? So Gia, who leads partnerships on my team, because we've taken on enterprise customers again the last couple of months. Like Walmart, for example, has built some really awesome experiences in spatial. And she was at the Enterprise Wearable Summit. I might be saying its old name, but it was in Dallas last week. And like she was telling me that the conference was booming, but not just like in every sector. And she said that in particular, simulation and training is just like bananas right now in terms of where like it's not even POCs, it's real like deployments and contracts being signed for it. And the cool thing for spatial is that like if we had wanted to facilitate those types of experiences 3 years ago, we would have had to build each one from scratch because the platform was not extensible. But because we built this Unity SDK with the goal of saying, hey, you could build whatever experience you want on top of spatial now, we sort of fortunately made our lives a lot easier coming back into enterprise because now it's actually very easy for us to like close the sort of like SaaS or product based contract and then separate out the services component of the agreement. Like they could build that themselves, they could hire Accenture to build it, we could build it, but there's flexibility there, which gives us room for scaling. So like my TLDR is like there is an enterprise metaverse right now. It's not the capital M metaverse. It's not like, I hop into corporate Facebook and I'm like meeting with avatars all over the world. But for training, for simulation, for visualization, anything that's sort of connected to learning as its like nucleus in some way, it's proving phenomenally successful. And like you could look in the Athletic, I'm like weirdly into sports, but the Athletic had a really good article maybe like a week ago about how Washington's football team, like their quarterback this year, who's a rookie, is doing amazingly well. And people are like, why is he so good? I'm sure a lot of it is talent. But in the article, he was like, actually, a huge component of it is he's training every day in VR. And
Wow.
that would have been pretty wild to talk about 3 or 4 years ago. This was like athletics part of the New York Times. This is like a huge article, not BS, and a team that's doing really, really well. So I think that's a pretty watershed moment for Enterprise XR.
Yeah, and look, I think there's really interesting case studies from the past on enterprises adopting a consumer product in an enterprise way. First comes to mind Yammer, right? The first
Yeah.
enterprise social network that Microsoft acquired for, I believe, back then a couple of $1 billion. I mean, Salesforce started their own thing called Chatter, which obviously didn't work, which ultimately led to them acquiring Slack for 27 billion. But Salesforce and Mark Benioff, this is what they wanted to do, a decade and a half ago. It was called Chatter. Actually, it's a pretty neat name, right? But it didn't work. So there was Chatter. I remember it. I remember the tool because I was deploying for my boss, Salesforce, in across the corporate back then. And then you now have a company called Island, which is building and doing incredibly well the enterprise browser, right? And on your business model, actually, one thing to keep in mind, there is a way to make a managed service scalable. It just takes awful lot of time, right? And but when you do, you're able to potentially scale that from a service into a product platform. And the best example of that is the new member of the $100 billion market cap companies, which is Palantir, right? I
I was
think
literally gonna say, absolutely. And like there, I think there's even like some like tweet that's been floating around from like 9 years ago when they were going public, and someone was like, "Oh, that's not a real business; it's all services." And then it's like, "Oh no, it is a real business, but it's all services." It's like
it's a
it
real
turns out
business
that
in
is
all
a very valuable way
services,
to do it.
and
Yeah,
it took them like 15 years to actually become a platform. And not only it's remarkable and admirable, but there is a way to do that. But it takes time, right? And I think that also you need to be in a position similar to Palantir to close those multi-million-dollar deals with government contractors in many cases, at least in that category. So there's a way to do that. The question is, what's the time length you're looking at?
yeah,
Let's switch gears and talk a bit about spatial today. So you're already, shared there has been kind of a return to take advantage of the enterprise opportunity while you guys are obviously been evolving the platform from a consumer creator brand standpoint. So what is spatial today and what is the category you guys are going for and want to help shape into the next wave of the internet?
1000%. So to put like very succinctly, we're essentially the easiest way for people to create like beautiful, interactive, immersive experiences, particularly if you want them to be experienced across all devices. And we're finding, and this is where enterprise came back, that like that across all devices piece is really important. Because if you really just care deeply about like making a game to be played on Xbox or something like that, you'd probably just build it in Unity and then publish it the normal way, right? But where enterprises become really interested is that part of why a lot of things that enterprises try to deploy fail is because there's just a ton of friction getting people to use them. And part of that is security. And like anytime you want to install an app or something like that, it just adds a whole other hurdle you have to go through. And part of that is user experience, that like people like using things the way they like to use them. And anytime you're trying to get them to use this new customized proprietary thing that they have to learn how to do, it's a big pain in the butt. And so the fact that a spatial experience, yes, can be experienced in VR, but also could be experienced on a tablet or phone, and you could just install an iOS or Android app. And then, of course, through the browser means that if I am a corporate and I want to create a training experience, and I don't want to have to like get IT to coach each individual person in my 80,000 person company to learn how to install this thing, and I can just send them a link and it works, the the difference in engagement is monumental. It goes from like 100% of my employees can experience this thing instantly to like 50%, and then the other 50% I'm going to have to be on tech support with them for 2 hours each to try and get the thing to work. So that's huge. So from the enterprise side, that's where they're seeing the value. I would say it's like there's finally a way to create these gamified experiences that people like playing in their personal lives, but make it work in a corporate or enterprise environment without losing the user. And then on the gaming side, we're still seeing people building games on spatial. Like we've not been publicizing as much on that side. Obviously, previously we really publicized. Like we did a reality show that was like Shark Tank for game devs and things like that. But I would say that like the game devs that are building on spatial are building on spatial largely because they think it's like a maybe like an easier itch.io. Like essentially they could build a Unity game and then the process by which they can publish it and build an economy and things like that. It's just a bit more straightforward. Like itch.io is almost like I don't know, like Craigslist or something, and maybe spatial is almost like Facebook Marketplace. Like they kind of serve the same purpose, but spatial IO just has a lot more to make it a lot easier to sell or buy things, a lot easier to publish your game, a lot easier to find other games. So we are serving these like two very different audiences now with the same tool.
One of the things that when I think about quote unquote a 3D internet or an open interoperable 3D internet, which obviously the web needs to play an, a very important role in enabling an open metaverse in the future. But one of the things that I think are pretty clear at the moment, at this particular point of time, is that there's almost two different type of conversations we're having. The first conversation we're having is what the internet looks like for any person below age 25. And then there is what does the internet looks like for anyone above 25. On the under
Sure.
25, people live in Roblox land, Fortnite land, Minecraft land, I mean, Roblox went from 5 million monthly active users in 2017, I believe, to about a 400 million monthly at the moment, which is ridiculous, right? Rate
It's
of growth.
insane.
It's insane. And by the way, it took them almost a decade to get to 5 million monthly. And it took them another less than a decade to get from 5 to 400.
Yep.
And Roblox is fundamentally for anyone below age 25. I mean, there is no one above age 25 that would even know how to orientate themselves in a 3D persistent avatar based environment.
No
I
way.
like to say there is more in common between us and our parents than between us and a 10-year-old when it comes
It
to the
hurts to
behavior.
hear, but it's
It
true.
hurts to hear, but it is what it is, right? Let's call a spade a spade. And this is exactly where the gist of my point. Is the 3D internet only going to be really relevant when platforms are catering to not only the under 25, but when those 25-year-olds become much, much older? So if we want to build now tools that are relevant for anyone above 25, 30, 35, do those people are even relevant for that 3D avatar based modality? I see companies building immersive 3D commerce for retailers today. And my question is, why? Show me the 40-year-old who actually is going to go and buy their next pair of shoes as a 3D avatar versus me doing it in 5 minutes on Shopify, right? What's your take on this tension that I've just described?
Wow, that is like a incredible question, and there are layers. So I want to kind of go layer by layer. So maybe the first layer, like let's just talk about today, is there value in a 3D internet? Um, and then let's go by age. Let's talk about like above 16 and below 16. I'm going to use 16 or maybe 18 as like the cutoff. Above 18, I would say almost certainly not. And that is because there's just like a clear segmentation of preferences and habits across different use cases. And when I'm buying stuff, like I'm used to doing it a certain way. And that way is not 3D gaming. I would say like it's been standard ecom for a while. Like I search for the thing and then I find it and I buy it quickly. That was the Shopify example. I think 18 is an interesting cutoff because yes, like with Gen Z, there actually has been a change, which is probably like video based buying. Like I'm watching a live stream or something and I decide to jump in and buy, which is a big change from like viewing a static page to doing it in stream content consumption. And yeah, maybe in the future, like that will evolve once again. And, kids that are currently 8 will have grown up playing Roblox and their expectation in 8 to 10 years is like, okay, now when I buy something, I want it to be part of this experience. And therefore, I need there to be experiential shopping. And it's not just like for pop up stores in the real world, it needs to happen digitally. But that's not true right now for people over 18. And then I would say under 18, so as you get younger, it's maybe somewhat true, but this is where now there's a second layer of your question, which is like, what's the platform? Or at least like what's the medium? And I think that like the internet was invented in our lifetime. My first portal to the internet was a browser. And so for me, like using a browser for anything is very, very easy. And so unsurprisingly, during my lifetime, tools like Google Docs and Notion and like the browserification of all these tools happened because for me, that made sense. It was very easy for me to go from needing to download something to accessing it in the browser. For younger generations who are extremely used to like mobile as their first computing platform and they're very used to getting everything through the app store, I don't know if that friction matters as much to them. Like they're very comfortable with apps. And so the idea of like the unwalled garden, I just want everything accessible in the browser, like I don't really know if a 10-year-old today cares about that. So like this 3D internet, when people talk about it, usually the components are like how 3D, how interactive, and how walled is this thing? Like, is it a browser or is it Roblox? Is it Unreal 5 or is it like Roblox level graphics? Like, these are the things that people talk about. And I think there's a pretty compelling case that like it may like a lot of it may not be in the browser because younger people don't care as much about that. I will say, because we've obviously built a lot in the browser, that the flip side is, I think, number one is it's pretty remarkable what you can like what experiences you can facilitate in the browser today. I think a lot of us are used to thinking about like flash games from 20 years ago, but we built like a nearly AAA looking game, or we didn't build it, a developer on our platform built it. they're called Pigiyama Kasama, and the game is called Kasama the Awakening. There's no GPU rendering. You look at it and you're like, what the hell? How is this a browser? And it's not even using web GPU, by the way. It's just using WebGL. And so you can only imagine with a newer standard that's allowing you to leverage better shaders, perhaps more compute power, like those games are going to look even better. But, and again, this is where like the story is a little bit nuanced. Going from PS1 to PS2, yeah, graphics really mattered. But nowadays, I'm not sure graphics really matter as much. It's really all about gameplay, and it's about the identity I've constructed in the experience, and it's about where my friends are. So this is a long-winded way of being like, I think that younger people are quite comfortable in the platforms that they're already in. And the last point I want to make, because you gave this incredible data point, right? Which was like 10 years to, I think you said like 5 million users, and then another 10 years from like 5 million to 400 million users. And that's like it's a brilliant setup, because the thing that we're really interested in, and this is like something we're studying, and maybe we'll have more to share like later this year, but something that we feel very strongly that we've observed is that we think VR has reached that first 5 million sort of moment that you described for Roblox for the same age group. So if you look at VR right now, they've sold, Meta Quest is overwhelmingly the most popular, more than probably like 30 million headsets sold. You're maybe saying like 10 to 15 million active users, maybe. And then you look at what the popular experiences are, and initially it was like people thought it was going to be these like AAA games. But right now there's been like a split, and you have these premium games that are targeted towards older users, sure. But now you have these free to play games like Gorilla Tag, Animal Company, Yeeps, free to play. Who's the audience? Go into the game and listen to them. They're young, right? Like these are players that you might expect would be playing Roblox otherwise. And you're like, like what's going on here? And Roblox has a VR app on the Quest, right? And the same players are not in Roblox in VR. They're in something else, which is not, shout out to Roblox. The VR beta app that they put out is awesome. But like there's something splitting here. There's like a mitosis happening for this kind of experience where I think like the shift to a new medium, in this case VR versus like PC or mobile or tablet or console, has created an opening. And the games that are succeeding, if you go and you play Animal Company or you play Gorilla Tag or you play Yeeps, like very embodied, very physical, very silly, not necessarily different than what you'd see in Roblox, but different enough in feeling that it feels like something new. And so I think you have insane numbers of those players gravitating to VR. And I'm going to end where you started, which is like when VR first launched, and who was talking about it? Older people. It was you and me and millennials and like Gen X people. We were so wowed by VR. And then lo and behold, like who's the generation that's really making VR happen? It's Gen Alpha. They're not fazed by nausea. They love being embodied in it. They can spend way more time in a headset than we can. And so I think, yeah, it's been like 10 years almost since the Quest was released. And that's what got it to like its first 5 to 10 million users. And I think you're watching a similar trend here, which is probably in another 10 years, you're going to be talking about like this audience in VR in the hundreds of millions, would be my guess.
Yeah, and look, I think it makes sense, because even if you think in the bear case, if you think about the bear case of VR, we can treat it as a new type of game console, right? Still, you should get to several hundred millions of active users. The bull case would be that it's not just VR, it's really more of a mixed reality device, right? Which is obviously what Meta is working towards, Apple is working towards. Side note, just read last week, Apple is planning to introduce a $2,000 device,
Yep.
still way too expensive for majority of the world population. But nonetheless, they're getting there, feeling the pressure from Meta. The bull case would be in 10 years, there should be a billion plus install base of this form factor, right? Whatever that is, with multiple different variations of games. But what I absolutely agree with you, similar to what we talked about, accessing a 3D internet through 2D devices, is that these new modalities, these new form factors, as much as we are techie and we're cool and we're in the know, this future will be first and foremost adopted by young people. Let's not forget, people who adopted Facebook when Facebook came out were people who were in university at the youngest age. It was 18, 19, but it was really the core age group or the core demo of millennials, right? It was people who were, when in 2005, you were either 18 to 22-year old. Like that was the group, right? Maybe 25,
100%.
right? In other Western countries like Israel, for example. So you
Yep.
really had the people who were born between 1983 and 1990. That was the Facebook generation, the YouTube generation as well, right? By the way, since YouTube was launched in 2005, more than 2 billion babies have been born around the world. Let that sink for a second. And this is exactly the same 2 billion I spoke about that are under age 20.
Yeah.
This is the metaverse generation.
I have to yes and you for a second. So let's talk about the YouTube generation because I think this is really important. The other thing that's really fascinating, if you look at again this generation coming up with VR, and you've seen, I mean, you're so plugged into Roblox and like UEFN, I'm sure you've seen a lot of this as well. It's also no longer just about the experience itself. It's no longer just about the game. It's about the experience of watching me or watching others play that game. And that's been also really interesting because what Roblox kind of grew on, right, which I think was like a back and forth between like people outside of Roblox, like on YouTube or whatever, making videos or streaming, and more people discovering what Roblox was and then coming in. And then Roblox itself became a big vector for distribution. It was like, okay, a game can go viral within Roblox, right? And that I think happened alongside mobile, which was super different, which was more like targeted, like, okay, here's just a machine of buying super targeted ads really cheap. The mobile thing doesn't really work anymore. That's happened over the last couple of years. But the viral vector is still going strong. And this new VR based free to play world, all of the user acquisition is done virally. And it's not just through, by the way, like the big influencers, right? Like, yes, you have your like 100,000 million follower people that like you get to play a game, but actually it's much more organic than that. And you wouldn't believe like what percentage of the players have like 20 followers, but are recording themselves playing the game. And in this like very broad micro way, they are promulgating the game as well. And it's why like not only is the game now itself very important, but it's how you manage the meta layer of content creation and distribution, because you really need to think now from the get-go, like, how am I going to create a really great experience that people can record themselves in? And I think that's been increasingly true on Roblox as well, where it's like, okay, yeah, it's not just the game that's fun to play, but it's like, what's the game that's going to be really eyebrow raising if people record themselves, and what are the moments that I can almost script into the game that I know are like the moments that people are going to want to play. That's like what's really been preoccupying us. And again, it's like, it's not that what's happening in VR is entirely new. I think it's just in some ways like a more concentrated form of what began in this world of Roblox. And in some ways it's even more important because like the discovery happens outside of the headset. In like Roblox, it's like I'm in YouTube, I see something, I could be like, oh, I want to play that. I'm literally still on the same device. I go and play Roblox. That's not necessarily true for the VR games. So when you reach the person on YouTube or TikTok on their phone, you really need to reach them because that moment has to stick with them enough that they're going to go and grab another device and throw it on their face, which is just a very cool challenge.
And I think, I mean, in to wrap up that point, I think there's like two. It's almost like there's two distinct form factors that are happening that I think are amplified by this new generation of users. One form factor is the physical one, which is VR devices, and very soon AR devices, because I think that will open up. I mean, if we thought Pokemon Go and what Niantic has done was cool, I mean, let's wait until there's actual consumer version of AR glasses that you can literally play whatever you want, wherever you want. And the new games you're going to be able to play are going to put Pokemon Go to shame, most likely, in a good way, right? So that's one form factor, which is the device one. And then you have another form factor, which is more the virtual form factor, which is the avatar piece. And both of those form factor, one purely digital, one physical, I think are driving and are driven by this new generation of internet users, right? As young as 5 years old and as old as 20 years old, most likely at the moment. And that's going to usher a whole new, I think, opportunities for brands, for creators, for platforms. And also the other thing that we really didn't talk about much, but naturally is critical here, is creators,
Yeah.
right? And the fact that these tools and platforms are also fundamentally continue to democratize creation and creativity. Uh,
Yes.
right? Roblox has basically taught a couple of million kids to learn to code, learn to build a game. Now they're learning to build a business, right? Unity is going back to focus now on their engine for games and game development and game studios, continuing to democratize access to creativity. Obviously, Epic with UEFN and Tim Sweeney's vision of you build once and you can you build on UEFN and you can launch it on Steam and you can launch it on Epic Store and etc. So and what Meta is doing obviously, and I think VR creation will need to continue and be democratized in terms of the experience. So certainly there's just so many vectors of activities that are really really exciting and makes me optimistic and excited, which I think is really just as much as we've seen a lot when it comes to quote unquote what is that next internet 3D internet. We're really at the very very beginning.
Yes. And I want to pat us on the back because this is the longest any podcast in the last 2 years has gone without saying AI. So I finally broke it. AI. We did
Well,
it.
you have an opportunity because my last question is going to be, what are you most excited about for the next 12 months?
I mean, so cool. I'll talk about I obviously now opened the window for myself, but yeah, I think to build on what you were just saying, because we've worked really hard on this. Like the question we've asked ourselves the last couple of years is like, how can we change a game dev from someone with like deep Unity experience or deep, Roblox experience where they've been building since they were like 16 to something much more accessible. And I think what I feel, I mean, I won't speak for all of Spatial, but I think the company's probably like more or less aligned on this, is I think we've probably reached the limit of what I would call UX or interface innovation for this. So this is like the Figma like type stuff where it's like, okay, how could you make it easier for people to be UX designers? And then you invent something like Figma and you're like, okay, oh wow, there's like a lot of primitives and a lot of drag and drop and like this makes it a lot easier. And I think on some level, people have wanted that to be true for game design. Oh, if I create lots of templates and I give you lots of 3D assets, like maybe I could make it like a PowerPoint creating a game. And I would say it's been pretty clear that that just doesn't work. Like there have been so many attempts. And part of that is just because there's this whole other dimension called interactivity, which is like, yeah, you could drag stuff into a place, but to actually create a story and create interactivity and then all these things that add up to immersion and engagement, you can't, that's just really really hard. And so this is where I think probably AI fills some of the gaps. I remember I wasn't at the most recent Roblox developer conference, but the one before that where they first introduced some of their AI tools, and I was really blown away because I do think that a conversational interface is extremely helpful in prototyping games to say like, here's the story and I think here's the general aesthetic of the game, here are my influences, like I'm thinking of a map like this and I want to move this there. It really starts to chip away at what I think is the last wall that prevents a lot of people from creating a game, which is at some point you reach this moment where you're like staring at C# and Unity or whatever, and you're like, I don't know how the hell to write this code. Like, I literally don't know how to put the language required in here to make this thing happen. Whereas an LLM says you will never really have to know because you can actually just focus on the experience and the outcomes. And yeah, if there are errors, then tell me there are errors and I'll go and debug them. But it removes that skill and wisdom. Now we're not there yet. I'm not saying like, top ranking game is going to be made through LLMs like this year. I think it's going to take a while. We can't even generate assets that are that good yet. But I'll tell you this, I hadn't coded since I was 16. And this week I was like, this is ridiculous. Like I should be able to write code with the tools that are given to me. And I went into initially ChatGPT and then Cursor, and I was trying to create like a bot to do some analysis on a game we built, connect to this API. Okay, I want to use Llama as my model to do the analysis. Again, I haven't coded since I was 16, working bot in 2 days. So if I can do it, and I'm dumb, like if I could do it and and I could create a bot today, then I think it follows reason that like that will get easier and easier for meatier and meatier categories of software. So probably it's easy to create scripts right now. Then in the next couple of years, it'll be easier for people to create software that has UI. And then we'll get there where it's going to be easier for people to create immersive experiences. So I'm very excited to see advancement there, but it's probably going to take longer than this
And
year.
there's going to be an explosion of creativity. And until that happens, and while it happens, Jacob, Spatial, 3D Internet, this was awesome.
Love you, Jan. Keep doing what you're doing. This podcast is incredible. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Into the Metaverse. We hope you learned a lot and explored new aspects of the metaverse.